Excuse me. Hi, Mr. LonerBox. Hello.
Okay, so on Monday I did a stream and I was going to go back in time and talk about Ethan and Hassan, what the origin of this beef was. Why is Ethan getting so unhinged on the topic of Palestine and Israel? I thought I would be done talking about it for at least this week, and then this happens. So Ethan Klein has LonerBox on his stream. And before we even get into Ethan Klein, let's just do a bit on LonerBox. So, Bad Empanada, no matter what you think about him, he did a pretty good job compiling some clips of LonerBox. And I just need to I need to set the groundwork so we know who we're talking about here. Let's
by what they are doing. The fact that they are doing these things says nothing about whether them doing those things is actually justified or not.
Let's assume that every case
in the Israeli military on the orders of Elon's former bosses in the Israeli government. So yes, I choose to oppose this horrific and homicidal motion.
I think the problem is that if you want to get, I'm trying to think of like how you would illustrate what's wrong with what Mehdi's saying. Is let's assume that every case that Mehdi put forward was true. When he talks about particular incidents like the WCK bombing or the person who was the child who was shot while they were in a car or like all this kind of stuff. So if they're talking about that, then it's kind of like saying that doesn't really, you could just argue none of that actually says whether or not the broad military campaign is justified or not. You understand that, right?
So apparently the fact that Israel is clearly systematically committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, pretty much every international crime that you could ever think of on a mass scale, patterns that make it clear that they are there in order to do what they are literally doing. We, however, cannot judge their so-called military campaign.
Yeah, so makes a comment there that like he's basically defending genocide, right? We can't actually stop genocide because like we don't know if that's actually the point of what Israel's doing. Sure, they're like they might be accidentally doing it, but if it's an accident, then we can't really target it, right? And then this is a crazy clip. Also, shout out Bad Empanada.
Work like the problem with sniping isn't like the accuracy is not because obviously you got.
Okay, so this was crazy. Again, all credit to BE here. He found this clip and he brought it to prominence. I'm just like regurgitating it here before we get into this Ethan Klein conversation.
Exact targets. There is no tunnel that justifies shooting toddlers in the head. Israeli snipers.
Does this guy not know how sniping jobs work? Like, the problem with sniping isn't like the accuracy is not because obviously you got your scope and the fucking like yeah, it's quite easy. You can accurately snipe, but targets and personnel move really, really fast when you're sniping. Like snipers make their decisions in less than a split second in combat situations. Unless he's suggesting there were just a couple of kids sitting on the hill and a guy opposite in a building just went, got him, take him out. Maybe someone committed a war crime. But I don't think that's Israeli policy is to snipe kids for no reason, to snipe toddlers, but okay.
You can tell us why.
Okay, so pretty gross stuff here, right? He's defending he goes from defending the snipers, saying that, well, snipers, that was just like when a cop shoots someone that comes out like a dark alley and they just have that split second reaction. Oh, I didn't realize it was an 8-year-old kid. I thought it was like a 30-year-old guy with a gun and he was coming at me. And it's like, it's just a kid with like a toy train or something in his hand. So he's making the argument that Israeli military snipers are doing these like jump scare shots. They see a target and they just are blasting it. He's trying to defend them for not doing war crimes in that scenario. I don't understand how that's any better. Like maybe you can say it's not as premeditated as if they're just like lazily training their crosshairs on like a 2-year-old Palestinian and then blowing his head off. But you're essentially LonerBox's argument is they're not purposely trying to kill kids. They're just shooting at anything that moves. They just see someone running and then they blast them. So, again, not exactly a defense of what Mehdi Hassan is talking about. And then LonerBox is going to do this time and time again. So this is why I wanted to bring up these clips. He will take acts of, like, he'll take genocidal acts, war crimes that Israel does, and say, well, that's bad, and we should prosecute those people. But I don't think that constitutes genocide, because Israel does not have an explicitly stated policy of genocide, which is insane to say. So why is he looking for the smoking gun? Well, he's looking for the smoking gun because he wants to give Israel plausible deniability, and that's Israel's whole campaign. One thing that he doesn't talk about is, there's a direct relationship, there's a direct parallel between what Israel's doing with this, like, passive trickling down of orders of genocidal intent against Palestinians, and there's not ever going to be, like, there's these top-down orders that are distributed throughout all branches of the military saying that we should kill toddlers. So there's never going to be that. And guess what? There wasn't anything like that in Nazi Germany either. Hitler very specifically gave out muddled orders to his followers. And even in terms of, like, the concentration camps and the Jewish genocide that was happening in Germany, those were extremely muddled because Hitler wanted to be able to have that plausible deniability. He did not want to have any records of him explicitly saying we must kill all of the Jews. So he would talk to local commanders on the ground and be like, take care of the problem. And they'd be like, okay. Some of the commanders would take that to mean arrest everyone. Some of that would take that to mean that you boycott the stores or you break down Jewish stores. And then some commanders would take that to mean that we need to kill all of the Jewish people. So you had vastly different types of ethnic cleansing in different parts of Germany because of how muddled Hitler's orders were. So it's the exact same thing. No one's going to want to straight up do a genocide or tell people that they want to do a genocide. And so they do have this, like, very veiled kind of information and orders that they pass down. So just keep that in mind. You do not need to have the explicit order of, I commit you to do a genocide. I order you to do an ethnic cleansing of all of Palestine. You do not need that in order to have a genocide taking place. And so when LonerBox says, well, sure, there were snipers that killed kids. That's a war crime. You should arrest the snipers. That doesn't mean what Israel is doing is bad. It's like, okay, but if every single, like, if you add up all of the individual acts that Israel's doing, it's all bad. What has Israel done that's been good? Like, even the hostages they rescued killed, like, over 100 Palestinians. And they haven't rescued any other hostages. So what have they been doing that's been good, LonerBox? That's what I would say. It, like, all constitutes genocide. The entire thing, like, when you add up all of the little pieces, that's genocide. And then when you look at all of the little pieces, those were all, like, horrible, atrocious war crimes. So anyway, I would recommend you to watch this Bad Empanada video because it's pretty good. Like, he's just compiled these clips of LonerBox and Destiny of them being genocidal freaks. That brings us to Ethan Klein. So we all know Ethan has had a fun time criticizing people for being a little bit too pro-Palestinian. When you go too pro-Palestinian, then you start hurting Jewish people's feelings. Or, according to Ethan, it's Jewish people's feelings. Is it really, though? Is it really Jewish people's feelings? Let's find out. Let's just get into this. This is a long fucking clip. This is a long section of the podcast that we need to listen to, so I'm just going to get it started.
So, to address the title is, what's the title?
I haven't been well.
Oh, yeah, so, excuse me, goddamn. A lot of people have been...
Bro, someone get this man a cough button. I know I don't have the cleanest audio myself, but I'm not, like, hacking up along into the microphone. Someone get him a cough button, please.
saying that this is the hot new phrase from the kids, crashing out. Hassan was on a stream saying that I'm having a, quote, narcissistic crash out. I don't know what exactly that means. But people say, man, you must really lost your mind. And after some self-reflection, I want to say that I apologize for nothing. I feel grounded and centered. I feel like standing on my principles proudly, and I apologize for nothing.
Wow. I did not expect you to say that.
Nobody did. Nobody expected it.
It was truly shocking. What a twist.
Well, no, I want to make it clear because people, I think they think that they're going to bully me into being like, maybe I do need to, maybe I am crazy or something. It's like, no, I am crazy. I mean, don't get me wrong, but like, not more than usual.
Just the baseline.
That's the funny thing. It's like, y'all have been fans of me for years, and now I'm crashing out. It's like, all of a sudden, when I disagree with you.
You've been crashing out since
I'm not even disagreeing
2012.
Exactly. The only thing being crashing is these nuts on your mom's fucking chin.
Whoa!
Bitch.
Easy there, Tiger.
Like
Come on.
2 thunder fucking claps. Pow, pow! All right, let's call.
So I do want to just say that there are many clips of Ethan criticizing Israel in the past, and now he's defended it. So when he says, I haven't changed, it's all of you that have changed. He has changed a little bit. He's changed on what he defends. Him personally, his personality hasn't really changed. I don't think. He's always kind of been this edgelord. He's always kind of been very emotional and resistant to any kind of pushback against what he puts out there. So his personality hasn't changed, but he is getting like way more touchy on Israel.
Okay. Do you want to do a little setup or anything, or should I just let this
You can bring him in.
Okay.
I'll do it with him.
Jesus Christ, dude. Fucking hell, get that looked at.
Stand by. Stand by. Just a moment here. Okay, getting connected.
People don't have waiting music like we have.
Nobody does it like us.
All right, I'm just gonna play a few more things on LonerBox. We have here LonerBox with Destiny and Elon Levy, who is an Israeli propagandist. So he was like a spokesperson for the IDF. And then just some, just some cringe
But they were
stuff.
trying to call you a pedo yesterday.
So some kids are really
They
hot.
dug in deep.
Oh,
It happened in the same day that I was getting accused of wanting to kill babies, like wanting to snipe them or whatever. Fucking Israel.
some babies are really annoying.
But it's like, how's it that we're both aligned then? If like you want to fucking rape the kids and I want to kill them.
I'm a necrophiliac
Okay,
pedophile.
that's the holy fucking sentence.
After you kill them, I have my way with them.
Jesus.
We could have had a better response there. Could have said it's just incompatible. Like, how can I be killing them?
Okay, or that.
Oh well, fuck it.
Okay,
But they were trying to
so
call you a pedo yesterday.
So
I mean, it's
some
dumb,
kids are really
They
right?
hot.
dug in deep.
Oh,
it's dumb, right? But this is the guy that Ethan brings on as the political expert. He pretty much resides in this edgy, I'm willing to say what other people aren't going to say because I use facts and logic. And how can I be accused of killing babies if people are saying that we're aligned and you want to rape them? So, I mean, isn't that antithetical to wanting to kill kids, wanting to have sex with kids? Like, he's doing this stupid, oh, I got you in a logical trap joke. And this is the guy that Ethan's bringing on to talk. He's going to be the new Hassan, right? That's what Ethan says in this. Oh, LonerBox is he's the new, less unhinged Hassan.
I don't think so. In fact, I know so. What you eating, love?
Some taco.
Taco spot?
Yeah, tacos Gavilan.
Is that the place to package it up?
Come
on?
on.
It is. It's my go-to.
What kind of tacos you get?
Huh?
What kind of tacos you get?
I got 6 pastor. That's my
Wow.
shit. I always get pastor nowadays.
When are we gonna dance live?
I like the fattiness.
Is it?
All right.
Excuse me. Hi, Mr. LonerBox. Hello.
Hello, Mr. H3.
I can see you. Can you hear me and see me? Okay.
Yeah, I hear and see you. Actually, you're.
Okay, so just a little bit of background about how I'm coming into this video. I was going to react to this video because I thought it was just Ethan reacting to a clip of LonerBox when I was like scrubbing through the podcast. And I'm like, okay, that will probably take what, like 20 minutes to get through. I think it's going to be like a 2-minute clip that he reacts to. I did not realize that he interviewed the guy And so then when I was listening to the podcast later, I'm like, what the hell? He's actually bringing him on to an interview? And I couldn't believe it. Simply because I had seen those like bad empanada videos where he's straight up like defending Israel's actions in Palestine. And this is the guy that Ethan's bringing on. So again, this is a few days later. This is a few days after Ethan was talking about trying to reach out to the Try Guys, because Ethan's like, I haven't said anything bad about Palestinians. Well, now you're interviewing a guy. You're not only interviewing him, but you're painting him in the light of an expert on the issue of Palestine and Israel. And that's the guy you're bringing on to a podcast as an expert. And you're trying to say that you're not saying anything bad about Palestinians. So we'll see. Let's get into this.
A bit quiet. Let me turn you up.
Excuse me. Thanks for calling in. I know it's super late. What time is it there right now?
Oh, it's only 11. And
Oh,
I'm a
that's
bit
not
of a
bad.
night owl, so I'll manage it.
And you're in Scotland, right?
Mm-hmm.
So are you a native to Scotland? I'm unaware
I
of.
mean, no reference to the ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu at all. No references for the arrest warrants for Yoav Gallant, which Ethan doubled down at in calling a pretty good guy. Like, we can get into that video where Ethan doubled down on saying that actually Yoav Gallant is a mediating force. He is like a moderate force in Netanyahu's cabinet.
Your background. I know you're Lebanese by background, but I don't know. Did you move to Scotland, or were you born there?
No, my family's Lebanese. I was born in Scotland. My dad's side of the family is Lebanese. My mum's side is Scottish. So I've lived here almost all my life.
Oh,
Lived in
okay.
the Emirates for a little while. Been to Lebanon a couple of times, but mostly Scottish. Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you is just because I've been talking a lot about Hassan and people like him and how I don't agree with their brand of like leftism. I myself am a liberal and a leftist, and I think in an effort to be more productive in this conversation, it'd be good to introduce people to somebody on the left that I do think is great.
So we went over it. Well, actually, I don't think we went over it, but I watched back Ethan's debate with Hassan on socialism, and Ethan's like, okay, well, I understand, like, we should have more like social safety nets. Like, we should have healthcare for people. We should have like more cheap housing for people. That's essentially what Ethan says. And so when he says that he's a leftist, what he doesn't say is that he's like not against capitalism. And that's like the main point of being a leftist, right? You're trying to fight against capitalism. You're trying to fight against this system that is inherently unstable and will lead to people like Trump taking power. Like, capitalism is wealth extraction, and as long as you have capitalism, you have like powers pushing at the government to allow for more capitalism. That's essentially what it's talking about. And so when Ethan's like, I don't agree with Hassan's brand of leftism, what are you talking about here? So again, Ethan's gone past just criticizing Hassan for creating anti-Semitism in his community. He's criticized him for his Ukraine takes. He's criticized him for not endorsing Kamala Harris. He's criticized him for fighting against capitalism. It only took Ethan 13 months to say that, well, Hassan said America deserved 9/11, so he's a pretty radical terrorist guy, right? Like, he straight up said that in one of his Ethan Klein videos. So again, what are we talking about here when Ethan's like, I don't agree with Hassan's brand of leftism? It's an interesting phrase that he says, and it's not like I don't agree with his stance on Israel. It's past that now. Now it's more of a personal attack on Hassan, and even on Friday's episode, Ethan said that this is a personal beef between Hassan and I.
Great. And that I do think people could watch and enjoy and get some political analysis from. So that's kind of like the motivation for having you on. And
Okay, so just one more thing. Ethan is complaining about Hassan platforming Bad Empanada because that Bad Empanada did like unhinged tweets, and he made a video apparently where he was like hunting down IDF members. I don't really give a fuck. But what was Hassan doing? He was reacting to Bad Empanada's video where Bad Empanada was like talking about Destiny and LonerBox being genocide defenders. He wasn't promoting Bad Empanada's ideas. He wasn't saying like, this is a great guy, everyone should go watch him. That's literally what Ethan's doing. He's saying that this guy is the better version of Hassan. He has better politics than Hassan. The point of me bringing you onto my podcast is so that my audience will watch you. That's literally what he's saying. So when he complains about Hassan platforming Bad Empanada, when Hassan prefaces this by saying that, like, yeah, Bad Empanada is a pretty unhinged guy, but in this very specific context, I think the video that he made is valid criticism of genocide defenders, and that's why we're going to watch it. That's extremely different than what Ethan's doing, where he's like, no, you're actually an expert on the issue of Israel and Palestine, and people should take your opinion seriously.
Should watch and enjoy and get their brand of like leftism, and people like him, and how I don't agree with their brand of like leftism. I myself am a liberal and a leftist, and I think in an effort to be more productive in this conversation, it'd be good to introduce people to somebody on the left that I do think is great, and that I do think people could watch and enjoy and get some political analysis from. So that's kind of like the motivation for having you on, and yeah.
So you were looking for.
So yeah, the motivation for having him on is getting people to stop watching Hassan and start watching LonerBox.
It's a lot of pressure, but okay.
No, it's a full-on Hassan alternative. You are tapping in and coming into the ring. No, I just think you have a good perspective. I mean, where do you come from? You're definitely a left-leaning.
Ethan doesn't know anything about this guy. What makes Ethan think that this guy's a good perspective? Maybe he's seen some clips in the Destiny Discord that he hangs out in.
But I feel like on certain topics where people go super far left, you have a more like nuanced and thoughtful take.
Okay, yeah, like what? Can you give me a fucking example, Ethan? So he's saying LonerBox has a more nuanced take than people that go super far left. And it's weird that Ethan obviously brought this guy on to back him up on his position of Israel and Palestine. That's quite obvious what Ethan's doing. But it's weird that he's couching that purpose in the language of, you are not as extreme left as Hassan is. But you're not going to come up with a single example, are you, Ethan? Are you just going to say that Hassan is extreme left because he didn't endorse Kamala Harris and that cost the election for her? Is that what you're going to say? Are you going to say that it's because Hassan isn't super mad about China, like, taking over Tibet and ending the feudal slavery system that they had there? Is that what you're going to say, Ethan?
Yeah, so I've been pretty much on the left since I started caring about politics, barring like a small, like 14, playing World of Warcraft and listening to crazy like right-wingers online. That was maybe my one phase, but it lasted like a few months. And then after that, I've basically always been on the left. Was definitely a lot more farther left when I was younger. And then I think since I started making content about 4 years ago, kind of two things happened at once. One was I noticed that what I understood to be like the 21st century version of like a socialist or a democratic socialist.
Bro, I'm just going to say this now. Like, no one gives a fuck about your history. Your political history. It's the least interesting. It's the least interesting topic of conversation you could possibly do. It's like telling someone a dream that you had. Wow, great. Good job, buddy.
Was very different to what a lot of other people online saw as socialism. I kind of thought the whole USSR simping and anti-democracy and liberal values was just a thing of the past. But that happened. So I kind of realized that there was this whole tanky authoritarian sphere that I didn't identify with at all. And then I also realized that just after doing more and more reading into particular topics, because I was actually creating rather than just watching other creators, I realized that I didn't always align with exactly the same conclusions. So I think the first example was Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
What I would normally do in my 20s was I would just, if I wanted to know something, I'd see there's an issue, and I'd say, okay, what's the left-wing commentators saying about that? And I would tend to just go with that and trust it. But when Ukraine happened, I decided that, well, I'm a creator now. I should probably just dive into this myself and see where it gets me. And I realized fairly quickly, after reading more and more about that conflict and the history and what was going on now, that I didn't align with the far left position on it at all, really. That all this talk about we're going to hand-wring about the Azov battalion, like a group of like 1,000 or 2,000 people at most, some of whom
the
were
so-called
Nazis.
Nazis,
And like,
yeah.
Yeah. And this is why we have to like this, and that's the level of purity testing that we're going to do to let a country of like tens of millions of people not get the arms that they need to defend themselves. I thought that was kind of ridiculous. Or conspiracy theories about a US-backed coup in 2014 in the Euromaidan. So I very quickly realized that there was this whole pile of things that I didn't really identify with coming from voices that I trusted. And then from then on, I've come across that maybe a bit more often. Still lean pretty far left compared to the average person, at least in the UK or America. Like, I definitely align with social democratic policies. I like workplace democracy. I think governments should support more of that. But yeah, definitely a little bit different from what I understood the left to be online. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of went through the same thing that people saw here, is that I didn't really understand what, like, I thought socialist, when I heard that, I didn't really think like, oh, communism, like Marxism. I thought like social democracy, like Bernie Sanders. But when I started...
Bro, is Ethan going to make the claim that when people say they're communist, they're like pro-Russia? Because I think he does have that conflation in his mind because of Hassan's takes on Russia. And LonerBox said himself that when the too far left people that he started resisting against were tankies, they were pro-Russian, and they're just like anti-US. And that's just another form of fascism. That's like the Russian flavor of fascism. Because Russia, so I hope this doesn't piss off my audience, but Russia is it's a fascist country right now. So yeah, being pro-Russia does not mean you're on the left. That actually means you're just another flavor of conservative.
Talking about like communism with Hassan, and then right afterwards, October 7th happened, I started to like realize that this, like, in my opinion, this like left-wing, like tanky adjacent shit was so fucking nasty, and I felt like I had to get away from it. Like, it was just scared me. Like, what the fuck? It was crazy.
Well, I've been watching it from a distance.
So I think this stream is going to be interesting because I think Ethan's going to be a little bit more mask off than he is usually. Because he has this guy, so he can kind of let his freak out. And Ethan's saying that October 7th and the tankiness drove him away and he needed to just be away from all of that. And again, when he had the conversation with Hassan explained it, and Ethan's like, okay, no, that all makes sense. Like, you can go back and watch The Leftovers. I think it was like The Leftovers of, I think it's called like Joe Biden is dying or something, or it's the one where Hassan dropped out. It's one of those two Leftovers episodes. You can go back and watch it. Ethan grills Hassan on his tanks on like Tibet. He grills Hassan on like Crimea and Ukraine, and Hassan answers all of that. And then at the end, Ethan's like, no, I understand, that all makes sense, but I'm still a capitalist. I still like capitalism. And so that's what these two guys are. They say they're on the left, but they're pro-capitalism. That's basically what they're talking about. And so when Ethan says, oh, I thought it was going to be like a Bernie Sanders type of socialism where you just heavily tax the rich. It's like, okay, people would like that, but the point is that that's not really a satisfying endpoint for political change. It's not just enough to like tax rich people. That's a great start, but you do eventually need to like really work on decommodifying a lot of necessary things. Like, I think there could be some capitalist markets under socialism for like luxury goods, but you really need to decommodify a lot of basic industries that humans need to survive, in my opinion.
You know, like, I think there have been definitely a few periods where I've just became like an H3 Hassan whatever React channel, because it's I think like, because I tend to like to go into deep dives about certain topics, but then I also realized that watching other channels talk about things like that and hearing disagreements is like a good way to springboard to get those conversations going. But yeah, and it's difficult to assess proportionally, because in the real world, people who lean that far left to a point where you've got like authoritarians and tankies or Hamas supporters, like, there's not that much of that outside.
Right.
But I guess because they don't have that much political power, they have invested a lot of effort into getting a very strong presence on social media, and also bleeding into normie spaces as well, which is a little bit more bothersome because they might not get the votes, but like that's where an increasing number of people are getting their information from.
Right.
More young people get their information from the internet, and that's going to keep on going up and up. It's not going away. And obviously that's the space I operate in, so kind of have to address it, and even if it feels a bit disproportionate at times.
So when I hear you talk about like Israel, Palestine, or Ukraine, I feel like you have like a really deep understanding of things. I'm curious what your research or like academic background is on this stuff.
I have no academic. So I got a degree in sociology, and then that was in about 2012.
Yeah, he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. And I've advocated for Ethan Klein to bring on any single kind of academic, and this is the person that he brings on. Bring on Ta-Nehisi Coates. Bring on Bassem Youssef. Bring on Norman Finkelstein. Bring on Mehdi Hassan. All of these guys would be so much more informative to have on than LonerBox. And just to cut this off right now, like nip this at the bud, let's listen to this.
It's impossible, and I think it would be depraved to try to defend it. It would be depraved, and I'm not about to go down that route. I limit myself to trying to explain what happened, and also to say that there are some situations which don't allow for a neat moral resolution. Real life is more complicated in many situations than simple formulas. It just gets much more murky. And I believe, just as William Lloyd Garrison, wrestling with the Nat Turner Rebellion, refused to condemn or condone, even as he described the acts as heinous, that's a dictionary definition. Nat Turner's Rebellion resulted in atrocities. If you look up in the dictionary an atrocity, it's an accurate description. But there is a distinction between the dictionary definition of what happened, an atrocity, and the moral judgment you render on the person who perpetrated that atrocity. And Garrison, seeing firsthand on a daily basis that other atrocity called slavery, couldn't in good conscience condemn the perpetrator, even as he said the acts in themselves could not be justified. Now, you might find that a cop-out, you might find that an evasion. I find it, in the situation he was presented, and in the current situation, I find it the only morally tenable position to take.
So slavery itself isn't a justification?
An atrocity, and the moral judgment you render on the person who perpetrated that atrocity. And Garrison, seeing firsthand on a daily basis that other atrocity called slavery, couldn't in good conscience condemn the perpetrator, even as he said the acts in themselves could not be justified. Now, you might find that a cop-out, you might find that an evasion. I find it, in the situation he was presented, and in the current situation, I find it the only morally tenable position to take.
So condemn the actions. You do not necessarily have to condemn the people, because you can put yourself in that situation and you can understand the systemic pressures that created that highly volatile situation that people in Gaza find themselves in. And the end result of that is violence. It's going to be violence either way. It's either going to be the slow, degrading violence of the Israeli colonial state, like crumbling Palestine, or it's going to be like the explosive, sporadic violence of resistance groups trying to take back any kind of freedom that they can have. So when this guy says that, like, when LonerBox is going to say that people are Hamas supporters, when he's saying that they can't condemn Hamas, that's all bullshit. You do not have to be a Hamas supporter to understand where Hamas fighters are coming from and understand the systemic pressures that created that violence. And then again, if you understand that, you do not, if you understand the systems that created this violence that we saw on October 7th, the correct position to take is not to condemn Hamas, because we are understanding that the agency is in the hands of the people that are creating these conditions of, like, oppression that creates the violence. So the correct position to take is not to condemn the terrorists and just say they should cut it out. Stop it. You're bad. Just like take a squirt gun and like spray water on them like they're a dog that just shit on the rug. You do not do that. You look at the person who has control of the dog and has put that dog in the conditions that it finds itself in, where it's only this metaphor is stupid, but the only option that it has is to shit on the rug. So you would look at Israel and the United States in this analogy. You'd be looking at Israel and the United States, not the fucking Hamas people, because they have no agency. It's all Israel and the U.S.
13.
And I mean, we're going to see throughout this conversation, both Ethan Klein and LonerBox pretty much put all of the agency on Hamas.
And then I completely ditched it and just spent the rest of the decade doing music, like music production, teaching, performance. And then I always had a kind of like secondary interest in politics. Like I would read a lot, or I would just watch podcasts or listen to commentators. And then eventually, after creating, I started reading more. So most of it is just like, if I ever look like I'm really well learned in a particular issue, it's usually when I was making video essays or streaming, it's usually just because I spent the week before reading as much as I could about it. So it's all just like one thing at a time, you know?
One video you made recently that really like resonated with me is you were talking about like how left-wing anti-Semitism is manifesting right now, which is obviously something that I've been talking about and caring a lot about. I find it's really hard to explain it because there's so many levels and there's so many different like ways to obfuscate. And I think a lot of people who are behaving in anti-Semitic ways.
Bro, Ethan's interviewing style is so funny. He has such leading questions. One thing I think is really interesting is that, I mean, he did this exact same thing with Galia on his podcast, right? Where he's trying to get Galia to shit talk Hassan. Oh, and what were you telling me today? You saw someone say that Russia deserves to own Crimea? And Galia's like, yeah. And who was that? Who said that? Hassan did it. Oh, Hassan did it. So what are Hassan's opinions on Crimea? That's what he's doing. And then Ethan, and then here he's like, so you've made some videos lately you've made some videos I find interesting lately. You've been talking about left-wing anti-Semitism. I think that's so interesting. It's hard for me to explain, but why don't you explain it? It's like, dude, it's hard for you to explain because it doesn't fucking exist.
Don't necessarily even think that they are. And you explained it in a way that really I thought was good. And I was wondering if kind of what your take is on the whole left-wing anti-Semitism. Like, where's it coming from? How's it manifest?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I remember what I said, because that honestly to me is just one of the most difficult questions to navigate, because people don't talk about anti-Semitism all that much. A lot of...
What do you mean people don't talk about anti-Semitism all that much? I don't know. I feel like I've talked about it a lot on this stream. I feel like I talk about it in the same breath as I talk about Islamophobia.
Even Western countries that have very good education systems, and where every other year in high school or even primary school, they ask you about, like, they teach you about the Holocaust and World War II and all that. But even then, there's so much that gets buried. Like in the UK, for example, like no one knows that the British basically purged the Jews like 2 or 3 times across the last 1,500 years. We learn all about the Scottish versus the English in Bannockburn, but we don't learn that Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, the guy who fought with the Scots, he was also the Hammer of the Jews. He borrowed a bunch of money from Jews and then didn't want to pay them back because he had fought the war with the Scots. So he just deported them all. He just purged them, and they weren't allowed back until like 500 years later. So, but that's just something that never gets brought up. And then even to this day, the UK still has a fairly low Jewish population. Scotland even lower. When it comes to left-wing anti-Semitism.
Okay, so are we going to talk about the media doesn't talk about anti-Semitism, because they definitely do? Or are we going to talk about we do not receive a proper education in schools? Which, I mean, I agree with that, but I would not agree with the fact that our education system disproportionately erases Jewish people from history. I think that there's a lot of atrocities that we do not learn about in our school systems, especially in America, and I'm sure it's the same in the UK, like as LonerBox said.
It's like, it's really hard to navigate because I don't think the majority of people who appear to be doing anti-Semitic things, who are on the left, are doing it out of any conscious dislike of Jews. Like, none at all. I think that it doesn't, in a right-winger, it's obvious. Right-wingers don't trust Jews. Like, right-wing anti-Semites think Jews control the world, run the banks, have a secret plan to destroy the world. But for left-wingers, it's a lot more opaque, and I think their issue is more that they arrive at anti-Semitic conclusions and anti-Semitic sentiments completely by accident. So, okay, I'm trying to think of how to explain this in a quick way, but
Example. So he's just saying that people arrive at anti-Semitic conclusions on the left by accident. Right-wingers genuinely anti-Semitic, and he said that. But let's focus on left-wing anti-Semitism because that's all that Ethan's been talking about for the last month and a half.
the way I think it works, and I'm still kind of mulling this over time, I think since the Cold War ended, I think a lot of like revolutionary communists or tankies or whatever ended up kind of lost. They didn't really have a story anymore because the big bastion of anti-capitalism was gone, right? So once that was done, I think people felt like they were in a position where, okay, well, we're not going to get global communism anytime soon. Like the great superpower war is done. But what we can support is anything that kind of threatens the global capitalist order. I think like in Chairman Mao's little red book, I think he literally says, anything that is good for the enemy is bad for us, and anything that's bad for the enemy is good for us, which seems really irrational. But it's not that irrational by their own logic, because you ever heard like sort of like communists say things like, oh, every time there was an attempted revolution around the world, it was squashed by the West.
Every time, yeah.
Containment, yeah. And to an extent that did happen. Like that was US policy, it was containment, stop it spreading at all costs. So it makes sense to think that if the only way that communism is going to have a chance of flourishing again is if the global capitalist order is like pushed out of the way. So anything that undermines that gives a bit of space for alternatives. And this has been kind of like part of their doctrine for the last 100 years. Even in Weimar Germany, like the German Communist Party, their number one enemy was not the Nazis, it was the Social Democrats. They called the Social Democrats social fascists. They basically, at certain points, actually aligned with Nazis on particular issues to try and get the Social Democrats dislodged from power. When it happened when the Nazis took over in 1933, the party line from the Communist Party backed by the Soviets was that, like, basically this is good that the illusion of liberal democracy and social democracy is out of the way, and this Nazi thing is just a kind of blip, and then after that the workers are going to rise to class consciousness and we'll have a revolution like a Soviet Germany. So they maintained that line up until the mid-30s when they were getting killed.
Right. So how does that lead into anti-Semitism, where they're like, it's basically,
that's just not true. Sure, you can say that their main enemy was the Liberal Party, and that's simply because the Liberal Party had the majority of votes. And so, obviously, who are you going to campaign against? Are you going to campaign against the people that are getting like 8% of the vote, or are you going to campaign against the people that are getting 70% of the vote? That's pretty simple, and that's pretty obvious. But we know that there's like mass violence happening between communists and Nazis. So it's not true that the socialists or the communists that were in Germany like sometimes allied with the I mean, maybe there's some examples where they did, but in general, they viewed the Nazis just as much of an opposition as they did the liberals. I mean, and the Nazis viewed them as competition too. Like they beat the shit out of communists. There were massive riots in the streets of Germany in like the 1930s because there was so much civil unrest because of like the shit economy that they found themselves in after World War I. And so there was a competing, like the liberals were failing, and then there was competing socialism trying to like fill that void that the liberals were leaving due to their failures. And then there was also the Nazism, the fascism that was trying to fill the void due to liberal failures. And unfortunately for the communists, the fascists won out there.
An anti-Western philosophy.
Well, now that you're far left, and if you're far left and you don't really have much of a story after the Cold War, then Israel-Palestine as a far leftist kind of gives you everything you want in a story, right? It gives you oppressors and oppressed. It gives you European settlers versus non-white natives. It gives you East versus West. It doesn't give you capitalism versus communism, but it does give you the great capitalist powers versus something else. So it's a big focal point for a lot of things that leftists care a lot about. And when you can, and for a lot of very complicated reasons, people get fairly disproportionately obsessed with that particular issue. And
oh, yeah, we're disproportionately obsessed by it. It's not like our entire fucking government is geared towards supporting Israel. And that's been on the top of people's minds for a year because Israel's been committing a genocide with our weapons for a year. We're disproportionately obsessed with it. And I mean, LonerBox, it's kind of funny here because LonerBox is pulling all of this out of his ass. Like, he's just spewing bullshit and Ethan's gobbling it up. Ethan's like, so tell me about leftist anti-Semitism. what has LonerBox said so far? He said that, well, leftists want, like, they loved the USSR because it's communist, but then when that fall, they didn't have a narrative. Like, he's basically pulling a Jordan Peterson, right? We need a narrative. People need to have the metaphorical substrate of their ethos. We need to be grounded in our metaphorical substrate. So that's what he's saying. He's saying that leftists need this metaphorical substrate of their ethos so that they can have, like, be grounded and be connected, have this narrative that ties them all together so they can be more human, elevate their level of human consciousness. But Russia's gone, so that substrate got ripped out. So now the substrate is attacking capitalism, and he seemed to vaguely gesture at the idea that leftist people look at capitalism controlling the world and say that it's Jews controlling the world. That's what he said, right? He's like, I'm sure you've heard that leftists say that capitalism destroys the world whenever socialism takes hold in a country. And Ethan's like, yeah, all the time I hear that. I hear that said all the time. It's like, yeah. Okay, so are you trying to make the claim that that's not capitalism, or people are misunderstanding the capitalism and saying that it's Jews doing that? Is that the point that he's trying to make? And now he's saying that Israel is such a compelling narrative, and that's why people care about it. But that care is disproportionate because, why aren't they caring about the genocide that's happening in Yemen? Why aren't they caring about the Uyghur genocide in China? What's the deal with Israel and Palestine? So far he said nothing. Like, he hasn't actually had any substantive critiques at all. Like, all of this has been fluff. He's just pulling this out of his ass. Again, people liked Russia. Okay, fine. But then it's gone. So now people are hating capitalism. Okay. And now people care about Israel because it's a compelling narrative. Yeah, genocide is usually compelling. What's your point? He hasn't made a point yet. I'm just going to rewind this to run back this stupidness.
Part of their doctrine for the last 100 years, even in Weimar Germany, like the German Communist Party, their number one enemy was not the Nazis. It was the Social Democrats.
Oh yeah, I forgot this stellar point he made too, that the Social Democrats teamed up with the Nazis to fight against liberals, and that somehow means that leftists now are anti-Semitic. Is that the argument he's trying to make?
They called the Social Democrats social fascists. They basically, at certain points, actually aligned with Nazis on particular issues to try and get the Social Democrats dislodged from power. When it happened when the Nazis took over in 1933, the party line from the Communist Party backed by the Soviets was that, basically, this is good that the illusion of liberal democracy and social democracy is out of the way, and this Nazi thing is just a kind of blip, and then after that the workers are going to rise to class consciousness and we'll have a revolution like a Soviet Germany. So they maintained that line up until the mid-30s when they were getting killed.
Right. So how does that lead into anti-Semitism, where it's basically an anti-Western philosophy?
Well, now that you're far left, and if you're far left and you don't really have much of a story after the Cold War, then Israel-Palestine as a far leftist kind of gives you everything you want in a story, right? It gives you oppressors and oppressed. It gives you European settlers versus non-white natives. It gives you East versus West. It doesn't give you capitalism versus communism, but it does give you the great capitalist powers versus something else. So it's a big focal point for a lot of things that leftists care a lot about. And when you can, and for a lot of very complicated reasons, people get fairly disproportionately obsessed with that particular issue. And if the goal is, if we see that Israel and America are kind of representatives of the global capitalist Western order, then sometimes people who don't really have that much else to support in the world in terms of communism or anti-Westernism they'll find themselves eventually accidentally falling into supporting groups that oppose Israel, even if they are some of the most rabid anti-Semites in the world, like the IRGC or the Houthis or Hezbollah. And I think that's more or less what happens. I think they hate Israel because Israel is backed by the West, and
yeah, that's why they hate Israel, because it's backed by the West. You don't need to be a leftist to hate Israel, and I think that's pretty obvious.
If that means tolerating the anti-Semitism of Houthis, Hezbollah, etc., that's kind of just worth it. And if it also means occasionally repeating their propaganda points or whitewashing their anti-Semitism, then so be it.
That makes sense because, like, when I look at these people on the left, like, I know that they're not like they're not racist and hateful people, but it's so hard to like explain it because, like you said, it's almost incidental. It's like accidental, and yeah, I think the way you said that makes a lot.
Okay, so he said that people are anti-Israel, and that means that they are sympathetic to other groups that are anti-Israel. That doesn't mean they're anti-Semitic. So, I mean, maybe he's going to try to make the case that if you say from the river to the sea, then that's an anti-Semitic slogan, and people say that accidentally. Or if you are supportive of Hezbollah against Israel as a resistance force, that means you're anti-Semitic. It doesn't make any sense. Again, like I feel like I don't need to explain this, but you can be supportive of resistance groups when they are actively resisting an occupying force, even if that resistance group is like, let's just say, like, subjugates women and says that women can get married at 14 years old. You can still be supportive of that group in the sense that they're resisting an occupying force. And then once they resist, you can be like, okay, now I'm not really supportive of this aspect of them. I was supportive of the resistance, but the fact that they're like treating women bad, that's not something I'm into. It's the exact same thing. Like, are you going to say, oh, well, you wouldn't last a day in Palestine if you're gay? They'd throw you off a bridge. What, queers for Palestine? Are you stupid? They'd kill you immediately. Like, that's essentially the argument that LonerBox and Ethan is making. Why are you supporting Hezbollah? I guess they'd say they hate Jewish people. They're horrible for women. Their politics are trash. They contributed to a genocide in Syria. Okay, well, I dislike all of those things, but as a resistance group to get Israel out of southern Lebanon, I'm fine with them. Like, again, as a resistance group, they function well and they do push against occupation.
A lot of sense. That the other thing I've noticed about these like ultra lefty guys that kind of trips me out is how much they hate liberals. Like, they hate liberals more than anybody. Like, they think liberals are fascists and essentially no better than like fringe right-wing, radical elements in the government. And I always thought that was so crazy because I love liberal democracy. I think it's fucking awesome. You know what I mean? And when I hear these people talk, it seems like the personal freedoms that we enjoy, religion, even the freedom to have to control what happens in your own workspace, right? Or speech, press, all this stuff is stuff that they don't necessarily even believe in. In fact, a lot of that stuff is probably something that would need to go under state control for the communist takeover to work, seems like.
Yeah,
I mean, we already have freedom of speech under state control, right? The state decides what you can and can't say. You can't harass people. You can't defame people. You'll face legal consequences for that. And just to do a pretty decently faithed response to Ethan's questioning of why leftists dislike liberals, it's because liberalism allows fascism to occur. It creates these conditions where the capitalist class is taking more and more and more from the working class, creating worse and worse conditions, and then eventually that will lead to fascism because people are going to want a change. And fascists usually run as like the change candidate. They run as the protector candidate. They run as the person who's going to make your life magically better. All you need to do is hate this one minority group, and your life can go back to the way it was as idealized in Leave It to Beaver. Your life's going to be great. Just vote for me, the fascist. And the reason that like leftists don't like liberals is because liberals have no response to fascism. It just slowly goes worse and worse, where liberals are like, yeah, but we'll give you like $25,000 to buy your first home. And then you get someone like Trump who's like, we can just kill like 50 million illegal immigrants and your life's going to be amazing. People are like, okay, I'm going to vote for Trump. There's no, like, liberals have no response against fascism. Like, pretty much every authoritarian government started off Like the authoritarian took power from a liberal government, and it does take like way more progressive, not even socialist policies, but way more progressive policies than what we've been seeing from the Democratic Party to effectively combat that fascist rhetoric.
It's hard to always get into their heads, because I can say that I used to enable a lot of, like I used to attract a very authoritarian, like far left community, but I never really went that far myself, even back in the day. So it's like, I think in a sense there is an internal logic to it in a way, because again, like liberal democracy is what, or social democracy essentially, is what saved capitalism, right? Like that's what they'll say about Roosevelt or about the New Deal or the welfare state in Europe or the beverage. Like the idea of those things is that they allowed capitalism to survive and to basically gain the consent of the people. And although you could argue that, well, if it also results in raised living standards or anything else, then that could give people the breathing space to start thinking about alternatives for society. I guess they just don't really buy that. That part of it I find a little bit harder to explain, because again, it's like it's always people who enjoy all the benefits of liberal democracy, right? Like you couldn't be, there is no Chinese version of Hassan, right? They can't exist, because you couldn't say like you could, I don't know what the Chinese equivalent of America's Reserve 9/11 would be, but if you said something like that to the Chinese, or like they deserve maybe like one of the Uyghur bombings or something, like you'd find yourself in jail long before you get the chance to escape in your like sports car or whatever, right? You'd be, yeah. So that part, yeah.
Okay, so just once again, it's not that it's criticism of liberals in a vacuum. It's criticism of liberals because liberalism gives rise to fascism. And this argument is silly to me, because they're saying that, well, Hassan hates liberals, but liberals allow him to have freedom of speech. They allow him to be able to talk about like how dumb the president looks, or how the government is doing a genocide in Palestine. If he lived in communist China, I mean, China's not really communist, it's an authoritarian system right now. If he lived in authoritarian China, then he wouldn't be able to say all of this stuff. But the point is that we are living under an authoritarian government right now. Like as soon as Trump gets into power, he's going to have massive crackdowns on freedom of speech. He's advocated for the burning of the flag to be like a prisonable offense. He has talked about like deporting college students that protest against Israel. His Elise Stefanik, his UN ambassador, has just ripped into college campus protests. Donald Trump has talked about wanting to shoot protesters in general, like just shoot him in the knees. Can we just shoot him in the knees? So yeah, Hassan has freedom of speech, and he's using that freedom of speech to try to keep having that freedom of speech. So this criticism of Hassan for being too leftist and attacking liberals doesn't have any legs. Like he's attacking liberals because they're allowing like an authoritarian dictator figure to take away the freedoms that these fucking idiots are talking about how much they enjoy them.
I've noticed too, like people like Hassan who I mean not him specifically, but it's like it feels like sometimes like this disease that festers inside, and it uses like its own structure to defeat it, and because of liberal values, it's hard for the society to even make the distinction of like, how do we disallow this? Because like we're all about the freedoms, and they're exploiting the freedoms to undermine the society we live in, and it seems somewhat like a paradox that I'm not really sure.
Wait, I have to run that back. So Ethan is saying that Hassan is, I'm just going to use Hassan as a stand-in for leftists. Hassan is so Ethan is saying that Hassan is advocating for the taking away of freedoms that he enjoys and that Ethan enjoys and that LonerBox enjoys. He is undermining those freedoms.
That part of it I find a little bit harder to explain, because again, it's like it's always people who enjoy all the benefits of liberal democracy, right? Like you couldn't be, there is no Chinese version of Hassan, right? They can't exist, because you couldn't say like you could, I don't know what the Chinese equivalent of America's Reserve 9/11 would be, but if you said something like that to the Chinese, or like they deserve maybe like one of the Uyghur bombings or something, like you'd find yourself in jail long before you get the chance to escape in your like sports car or whatever, right? You'd be, yeah. So that part, yeah, I find really difficult to
I've noticed too, like people like Hassan who, or I mean, not him specifically, but it's like it feels like sometimes like this disease that festers inside, and it uses like its own structure to defeat it, and because of liberal values, it's hard for the society to even make the distinction of like, how do we disallow this? Because like we're all about the freedoms and they're exploiting the freedoms to undermine the society we live in. And it seems somewhat like a paradox that I'm not really sure where that ends up.
I mean, that's always been one of the...
I mean, this is an example of a case where Ethan's going to need to elaborate on his point, because literally all he said is that Hassan is undermining these liberal freedoms that he's enjoying. You are not providing any evidence to back up this statement. I would like at least one example of what you're talking about, because honestly, I have no idea what he's talking about. And I guess I kind of have an idea, but you need to, in order to have any kind of idea, you need to go back in time, like a year in the past, and watch those leftover episodes, which I did that like a few weeks ago. So what Ethan is talking about here is he's saying that if we as a country went socialist and we really did get rid of capitalism, then that would take away people's freedoms, because you would have the state mandating what percentage of the company needs to be like owned by the workers and stuff, and they would be mandating when you need to give equity to your employees, stuff like that. And Ethan views that as a loss of freedom. He would also just view like the state expanding their control of freedom of speech under communism. That doesn't really make any sense, but that seems to be what he's saying Hassan is advocating for here. But essentially, like, his biggest issue with communism is company owners would have to give up total control of their company. They would have to democratize the workplace, which is something that Ethan just really does not want at all to happen.
Strengths of like a liberal democracy, though, or especially social democracy, is that it is good at hosting its own critics more so than any other or like a regime. Right. And I think for the most part, that's probably okay. I guess we are entering into a new phase where social media and disinformation and post-truth and everything is really hard to control. And the fact that but unfortunately, I think that side of things is probably getting a lot more weaponized right now by the American right? Like with Elon Musk buying Twitter and then using it to amplify things that he likes and to purge things that he doesn't like, and doing it with Russian money, doing the fact that it's like all these conspiracy theories that you would normally hear right-wingers make about the Democrats, for example.
Dude, yeah, that trips me out. Elon is literally like straight up George Soros. Like everything they thought George Soros was, he's like, that's who I am. Here I am. I'm fucking doing everything we said he was doing, and everyone's like, yeah, that's awesome. We love Elon.
And they're proud of it as well, right? They're like, there was that clip, wasn't there, when they were saying, oh, who is the right wing George Soros? And Elon Musk is just like, yeah, that's me. Oh, yeah, and then they clapped. I thought we didn't like it when people did that. Yeah.
It's kind of mind bending, yeah. Going back to like the Middle East, one thing that drives me crazy is the admiration that you see from Western leftists for organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah.
I mean, it's just kind of funny there. They're trying to have a conversation about how Hassan is undermining liberal freedoms. And they couldn't even stay on the conversation long enough to like finish their thought, and immediately they jumped to Elon Musk undermining liberal freedoms by like taking away people's freedom of speech, like him controlling Twitter, him basically like having a huge influence on democracy. Like they can't even finish their thought about how Hassan is taking away people's freedoms.
And
has to jump back to, isn't it crazy how people support Hezbollah and people support Hamas? Why aren't they advocating for the execution of everyone in those organizations?
Another comparison that I always see that I feel like is not very fair, and maybe you can tell me if you agree, is there the comparison to like Nelson Mandela and the ANC when they go like, oh yeah, well, you know, Hamas flew in and killed a bunch of civilians, but you know, that's what Nelson Mandela did too. And now they used to be called terrorists, but now they're actually freedom fighters that we love. It seems like not an honest comparison.
It's interesting how people who accuse everyone else of being Orientalist are so quick to generalize oppressed people from very different circumstances who did very different things and basically made very different decisions. If you're comparing Mandela to Hamas or Mandela to Hezbollah because they're both labeled terrorists by some people, I'm sorry, saying that, oh, well, Mandela was labeled a terrorist. Well, okay, ISIS were labeled terrorists. So would you say that? Like we'd say, oh, ISIS were labeled terrorists. Well, so was Mandela, so big deal. Well, no, some people can be incorrectly labeled terrorists and some people can be correctly labeled terrorists. Mandela, in his own words, was completely against what people would mostly describe as terrorism. When he was actually arrested for the first time, when he was on trial, I think in the mid-60s, after the ANC had resorted to a level of violence, now what type of violence matters, he explained his position very clearly. He said, well, we tried to go on strike. They made it illegal. we had our party, the ANC, they banned it. So we had, even though striking was illegal, we held protests anyway. We held protests that we weren't allowed to do just to see what would happen or to see if we could like make a good impression. And peaceful protesters were massacred at like Sharpeville. So they decided that they had to pursue something else. They had to go underground. But even then, in his own words, they chose between different kinds of resistance, different kinds of violence. There was, you could go for a revolution, you could pursue terrorism, you could do guerrilla warfare, you could target soldiers. But the option that Mandela chose was what he called sabotage. It was to attack government infrastructure like power plants, or to interfere with the railways or the telephone communications, or to pull down pylons. Because the whole idea was that the goal was to make this system, the apartheid system of South Africa, ungovernable. It is not sustainable. And we, with our, because the black people were the majority in South Africa, the large majority, if we do this, then you are going to be forced to concede, because otherwise the state's going to collapse. And
okay, so let's just listen to a bit of Nelson Mandela talking about this. So we go to
planning the direction and form that MK.
If we go to Nelson Mandela's book, we can listen to a very, we can listen to essentially what LonerBox is talking about. So let's give it a whirl. I'm just going to change this back down to 1.
The rule, not the exception of our lives. Ironically, we had more privacy at Lily's Leaf, however briefly, in this idyllic bubble. In planning the direction and form that MK would take, we considered 4 types of violence.
So MK is the military wing of the African National Congress, which is the resistance group that Nelson Mandela was a part of. Nelson Mandela was specifically tasked with basically recruiting soldiers and getting funds for the military, essentially army that the ANC was developing in order to resist against apartheid South Africa and the national government of South Africa.
Violent activities, sabotage, guerrilla warfare, terrorism, and open revolution. For a small and fledgling army, open revolution was inconceivable. Terrorism inevitably reflected poorly on those who used it, undermining any public support it might otherwise garner. Guerrilla warfare was a possibility, but since the ANC had been reluctant to embrace violence at all, it made sense to start with the form of violence that inflicted the least harm against individuals: sabotage. Our strategy was to make selective forays against military installations, power plants, telephone lines, and transportation links. Targets that would not only hamper the military effectiveness of the state, but frighten National Party supporters, scare away foreign capital, and weaken the economy. This, we hoped, would bring the government to the bargaining table.
Okay, so Nelson Mandela here says that sabotage is the unique form of violence that they use to resist against the South African national government. Now, sabotage is a form of terrorism. Let's not confuse anyone about that. Sabotage is the specific form of terrorism that the ANC used to try to bring about economic hardships onto South Africa. And guess what? Terrorism in general does bring economic hardships upon the country that is being terrorized, especially if you cannot effectively catch the terrorists and put an end to it, right? If it's ongoing terrorism, then countries are like, fuck that, this is an unstable country, I'm leaving here. And so when LonerBox is talking about how Nelson Mandela used sabotage as a violence against, he used sabotage as violence against his oppressors, whereas Hamas used terrorism as violence against their oppressors. What he's doing is what I've been talking about a lot. He is complaining that Israel, or that Palestinians, are not the perfect victim. They killed around 1,000, I think it's somewhere 1,026 people is the more official counts now on October 7th. They killed between 1,000 and 1,200 people on October 7th, and about 2/3 of those people were not military targets. Thus, they're not the perfect victims, and they have no relationship at all between like themselves and Nelson Mandela and the fight against apartheid that's happening in South Africa. So it's these guys who do want to whitewash history. It's the exact same thing with like Jewish resistance in Nazi Germany as well. There were multiple uprisings in ghettos, in concentration camps, and like unfortunately, the people that did do uprisings were violently retaliated against. But there were uprisings, and now we have whitewashing of those uprisings, saying that no, Jewish people were the perfect victims. They didn't do anything wrong, and they were massacred because of it. Well, you can say, like, obviously there's insane amount of racism, but when you say there was no threat of violence, like Nazis were so unjustified in killing Jewish people because there was no threat of violence that Jewish people had against the Nazi party. Well, that's just not true. That's a whitewashing of history, and you are whitewashing the past so that you can look at Palestinians and say they are not perfect victims. There is a valid reason why Israel is genociding them. And that is what LonerBox is doing with Ethan. Let's just play one more clip of this audiobook. If you guys have Spotify, listen to Nelson Mandela's audiobook, Long Walk to Freedom. It only takes 6 hours to listen through. I listened to it. I listened through the entire thing today. It's great.
On May 1st, 1960, until this side of eternity, the law helped transform the country into a police state. No dictator could covet more power.
Oh wait, that's not the chapter. This is the chapter.
The have always stood for a non-racial democracy, to impress upon the court that we had not acted irresponsibly or without thought to the ramifications of taking up violent action. I laid particular emphasis on our own resolve to cause no harm to human life. We of the ANC have always stood for a non-racial democracy, and we shrank from any action which might drive the races further apart than they already were. But the hard facts were that 50 years of nonviolence had brought the African people nothing but more repressive legislation and fewer rights. It may not be easy for this court to understand, but it is a fact that for a long time the people have been talking of violence, of the day when they would fight the white man and win back their country. And we, the leaders of the ANC, had nevertheless always prevailed upon them to avoid violence and to use peaceful methods. While some of us discussed this in May and June of 1961, it could not be denied that our policy to achieve a non-racial state by nonviolence had achieved nothing, and that our followers were beginning to lose confidence in this policy, and we were developing disturbing ideas about terrorism. Mkhonto was formed in November 1961. Experience convinced us that rebellion would offer the government limitless opportunities for the indiscriminate slaughter of our people. But it was precisely because the soil of South Africa is already drenched with the blood of innocent Africans that we felt it our duty to make preparations as a long-term undertaking to use force in order to defend ourselves against force.
Okay, so that was Nelson Mandela testifying in his trial, essentially his trial for leading a resistance army against the government of South Africa. And what does he say there? Our people that we've been representing and trying to get equal rights for have been wanting to use violence. They've been wanting to do a violent uprising simply because the usage of nonviolence has gotten us nowhere in this period of like this whole struggle. Nonviolence has gotten us nowhere. So now people want to do violence, and they did do some violence. Again, sabotage is a form of terrorism. Sabotage is violence. There were people that died. And they said, if we use violence, that's going to give the national government an excuse to do untold amounts of slaughter on our people. And then he counters with that and says, the ground that we live on is already soaked in our people's blood. There's already been so much systemic injustice and violence done upon us. It is imprudent of us to not make preparations to escalate the amount of violence that happened. And in the midst of making these preparations, Nelson Mandela was basically ratted out. He was caught, and then he was sentenced to prison for, I think, like, what, 16 years, something like that? Or it was like the 60s to 91. So that'd be like 27 years. So my point is that these resistance against a racist apartheid state is essentially the same thing. Hamas has tried doing nonviolence. We have had people that have done nonviolent marches and organizations against Israel, and Israel has met them with extreme violence every step of the way. So if you are going to put Nelson Mandela up as an example of a resistance figure who is like a shining beacon of hope and like the perfect resistance figure, then that is what that's what Gaza has been doing the entire time. They've been trying the nonviolence. They've been trying like doing it peacefully. Then they've been met with violent pushback again and again and again. And ultimately, nonviolence only gets you so far. And so they did resort to violence. And that's exactly what Nelson Mandela was talking about too. How the nonviolence was not working. And they did end up, like, they were making preparations for violence to like more violent resistance actions than just blowing up like a power line every now and then. More than just sabotage to target the economy, like the specific economy of South Africa.
And he specifically said that he chose to do that because sabotage did not involve loss of life. That's his exact words. He also said that it offered the best hope for future race relations because bitterness would be kept to a minimum. These are his exact words.
One of his things that he said that I feel like is always overlooked is that I know that he wanted to avoid violence as much as possible because he knew it would make reunification like difficult or impossible, you know? And that's like, there's like a empathy there, or like not even an empathy, but like even just pragmatic perspective where it makes sense, where I feel like people just give Hamas and Hezbollah a blank check to just fucking, you know, kill and mayhem as civilians, and it's just all in the name of resistance. Like there's just...
Yes, because Palestinians have never tried to resist through non-violent methods. It's not like they've been trying to get their story out there, pushing for more equal rights, pushing for a proper nation state that they can exist in for decades now. They've only been violent, and they just don't understand. Nelson Mandela had the pragmatism to at least try to attempt nonviolent means first. And he knew that if he was a little bit too violent, that would ruin race relations. Are you fucking kidding me? The race relations were as bad as they've ever been. Like, they're as bad as they could have been. Race relations was like the last thing on... it's the last thing they essentially had to worry about, right? They were pushing for equal rights, and they needed to get the fucking boot off of their neck. Again, we listened to his fucking autobiography where he says nonviolence wasn't working and we were making preparations to become more violent and more extreme. Even though that's going to bring more violence from the state back upon us, it doesn't matter because we are already existing under a violent structure where our people are dying.
It's just never, you know, there's no criticism for them because they're the oppressed.
I mean, you can kill babies and call it resistance. Like, it doesn't, you have to actually, if you're ever going to, I don't like it when people say, oh, I oppose all political violence, because the world is a pretty nasty place. And there are sometimes when the only way that people can defend themselves or liberate themselves or achieve.
Kind of a coincidence that this is the second time this stream LonerBox has talked about killing babies.
Their rights is through violence. That's happened in history with colonialism or with apartheid or anything else. But just explain how it'll help. Just say, how will this act lead from A to B? Mandela was able to do that. I think he persuaded people very well on that. And when things did go overboard, when the ANC militants would occasionally, either by accident or because some people just went rogue, when they did kill civilians, they sometimes took a bit longer than others, but they effectively disowned it. They didn't like that. Or people might think necklacing. Do you know what necklacing is?
I forget the exact description.
It's when you take a tire, because for some reason in South Africa, there are lots of tires lying around. I don't know why. They would take a tire and put it around someone's chest and shoulders. They would soak it in gasoline and then set them on fire. This was seen as like an ANC practice. But even that, most of the time that happened, it was used on other black people who were suspected of being informants. And although Mandela's wife, Winnie, supported it and spoke openly about it, the ANC hierarchy, the leaders, they actually reprimanded her for it. They distanced themselves from it because they knew it looked horrible and it didn't really achieve anything. It was just like violence for its own sake. It didn't really help anyone. So if you're going to talk about resistance, it's like, no, you don't get a magic word to just say, oh, well, that's resistance and therefore it's fine. Just explain how this will help. How did October 7th help Palestinians? How does suicide bombing help them? How does Hezbollah firing rockets that you can't aim into an area of northern Israel that's full of mixed communities? How does that help anyone? How does boarding a ship that's going from Turkey to India that's full of people from Asia and Ukraine and kidnapping them for a year, we still don't know where they are, by the way, how does that help Palestinians? Well, the fact is it doesn't, but you call it resistance and you make a propaganda video with music and people like it. Yes,
So
stupid.
I know what they.
Okay, so the reason why Hezbollah and Hamas like fire rockets into Israel is to basically put pressure onto Israel, right? Like what the fuck are you talking about? Why are you only why are you being ignorant on this subject? You have nothing to say when Israel bombs Palestine. You're not saying how does that help? How does that help Israel not get bombed by Palestine? You're not saying that. But you have all the smoke for Palestinians firing rockets into Israel, and you're like, how does that help? How does that help you not die? Come on, you fucking idiots. Why are you bombing Israel? Well, the point of bombing Israel is to try to make Israel realize that its position of being an apartheid state and colonizing its neighbors is an untenable position. They want Israel to stop colonizing them, essentially. Like, stop taking over land in the West Bank, stop having a complete like blockade and open air prison status for Gaza, for the Gaza Strip. Can you stop doing that? Like, and peaceful resistance isn't working. Marching up to people isn't working. Like, making your case to the United Nations isn't working because the United States vetoes that shit down every year. Whenever the United Nations has a vote on saying, should we make Palestine a sovereign state? The United States is like, meh. They do the Kristen Sinema curtsy where she's like, meh. So they have no options. They've tried peaceful resistance. They've tried diplomacy. All of those are dead ends. The only thing they have left, the only tool they have left to them is to try to put pressure on Israel to fucking stop colonizing them. That's the only thing that Hamas has left. I mean, Palestine has left in general. Otherwise, they can just sit there and slowly get killed and ground out of existence by the Israeli colonial complex, where they just, I'm going to take this house. I'm going to take this house now. I'm going to take that house. So, yeah, that's why they do terrorism, right? They do terrorism to remind Israel that there's still people there. There are still people resisting against them. And if you want the terrorism to stop, then you would stop colonizing them. Like, that is the definition of terrorism. You're using violence to achieve your political means. And again, terrorism doesn't only have to mean killing civilians. A lot of times it does mean that. But you can do terrorism against military targets. You can do terrorism against infrastructure targets. There have been examples of Hamas doing that. I mean, Hamas has a better record of targeting military targets than the IDF does. Do we want to get into that whole topic of conversation? And again, if you're going to say how does firing rockets into Israel improve your cause, Palestinians? You dumb little Palestinians, why are you shooting rockets into Israel? Where's all of that smoke for Israel when you're saying, how does bombing Gaza get the hostages back? You dumb little Israelis, stop bombing Gaza. How does colonizing the West Bank make your civilization safer? You're creating radicalism in the West Bank. You're creating radicalism in Gaza by keeping them in an open air prison. You're radicalizing these people. How is that making you safer? Dumb little Israelis, why are you doing this? Why are you killing everyone around you? People hate you because of that, Israelis, you dumb little idiots. Like, where is the smoke for the people that have options? Like, that's the thing. Palestinians do not have any options. The only thing that's left to them is bathtub rockets. Israel has options.
They would say is that it brought awareness. Like, before October 7th, people were not thinking about Gaza and not caring about Gaza. But after October 7th, now it became like this global movement and dialogue about it.
Again, I do not buy the idea that Hamas wanted, I mean, I could be wrong on this, but I do not buy the idea that Hamas wanted to do October 7th so that they could get a front page spot in the New York Times. Hamas attacks Israel. Everyone should now pay attention to Hamas and be like, okay, well, they are living under extreme conditions. Let's cut them a pass. I don't think that's what they were doing. I think they attacked Israel so that they could say, look, Israel, we have power. You need to respect us. Get the fuck off of our doorstep. Stop killing our people. And if you continue doing that, we're going to continue doing October 7th attacks against you to make your life to try to make your life just as miserable as our life. We need to exert a little bit of power over you so that you stop colonizing and you stop killing people. Can you do that, Israel? And Israel's like, nah, let's just do the final solution and kill everyone in Gaza.
That's great. 40,000 Palestinians at least, by the way, probably more, much more, have died. But tell their relatives who survived and are walking around the rubble that you've got global attention. Israel-Palestine has an insane amount of attention from the international community. They've got the last thing that they need is more attention, right? What they need is something that will actually work or that will actually lead them to get their rights. So even October 7th, like if October 7th had happened in the West Bank, honestly, okay, I'm exaggerating, but I don't think I would care as much. I don't think I would be like...
No, dude.
Yeah,
Can I interrupt for a sec before we move on from Mandela? It was my understanding that initially Mandela was adaptive of the Gandhi philosophy of nonviolence, but he saw it wasn't getting anywhere with him. And then ultimately he felt that violent resistance was the only way to combat the apartheid.
Yeah, that's exactly what we read, right? Where he said, yeah, being more violent with our terrorism is not a necessarily effective strategy, but it's becoming the only strategy we have left. And luckily for Mandela, the United States was not supportive of the South African national government. And because of that, international pressure caused that national apartheid regime to crumble. So it was Nelson Mandela bringing attention onto the situation, and then it was the international pressure on that apartheid regime which caused that apartheid to crumble. And so the ANC, the African National Congress, or Congress that was trying to fight for equality between black and white people, did not have to resort to violence. But if there was not that pressure, and if there was a world imperialist superpower like the United States defending that apartheid regime, then do you really think we would not have seen the African National Congress resort to more violent methods of terrorism? You are deluding yourself if you think that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, but it depends on what kind of violence, right? They did resolve to violence, but their violence was damaging, destroying government infrastructure. Occasionally,
Idiot. Nelson Mandela said that he would go even further than that. They would actually fight and kill people. They would not stick to just infrastructure. That is why I played that testimony that Nelson Mandela was giving. So while he did say that he did engage in acts of sabotage, he was also saying he's going to engage in more violent acts than that. So LonerBox is just he's whitewashing apartheid. That's what he's doing right now. He's whitewashing the past in order to paint Palestinians as a new and unique form of evil that Israel needs to fight against. So he's just lying here. This is misinformation, and I fucking love AB in this podcast because he does push against his bullshit.
People did die, but that wasn't their policy. They weren't trying to kill people. They were trying to disrupt the system and make
it becoming their policy.
Like an impossible system to maintain. I think between the 70s and the 80s, like 76 and 84, I think only 71 people died in MK operations. So the goal wasn't to kill people. The goal was to frustrate the apartheid system. So obviously, yeah, violence is a broad term.
You said 71 people died in what time frame?
Between 76 to 84, about 8 years of confrontations.
Yeah, I mean, that really puts it in perspective, in my opinion. Whenever people make that comparison, it's like, well...
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of saying, like, if we're talking about violence for the Palestinians, there'd obviously be a difference between armed militants in the West Bank destroying an outpost, right? Or even if like a settler tries to go up and set up an outpost, like the idea of like a Palestinian armed militant going up to them with a gun and saying, no, fuck off, like go back to your own country, okay? Like that's because that's the only way they can enforce that. I'm like, okay, yeah, good, do it. Yeah, I completely support that kind of behavior, but that's not what Hamas does. Hamas went into Israel proper and killed whoever, right?
What's this? The United Nations for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. If we look at here, this is the figures below represent the number of Palestinians and Israelis who were killed or injured since 2008 in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel in the context of the occupation and conflict. Okay, so this is Palestinian fatalities. And you can see that over the years, the lowest that we had was 28 people in between 20 and 2021. And then in 2014. So, and then if we look at Israeli fatalities, wow, in 2024 there was, or in 2023 there was 37 people killed. So what is the context of these? Because I'm not seeing, like, I guess, are they not wait, by contrast, data on casualties in the West Bank and Israel and other contexts is updated regularly beyond the 7th of October. Oh, so so they haven't added the casualties since October 7th. So this is a pretty accurate depiction of what LonerBox is talking about. So he's saying that, like, only 70 people died in, 8 years, he said? He said between 8 years, like, only 70 people died. And, 26 plus another 28, that's like 50, plus another 25, 75. So between 2016 and 2023, about 100 people died in Israel. So pretty similar casualty numbers, right? Like, am I misdoing my math?
Seeing armed militant going up to them with a gun and saying, equivalent of saying 76 to 84 in about 8 years of confrontations.
Yeah, I mean, that really puts it in perspective.
Between 76, the goal wasn't to kill people. The goal was to frustrate the apartheid system. So obviously, yeah, violence is a broad term.
You said 71 people died in what time frame?
Between 76 to 84 in about 8 years.
Wow.
So 71 people died in 8 years, and then we can see here that it's about 100 people dying in 8 years in Israel. And oh wait, no, that's the Palestinian casualties. Yeah, so in Israel, it's like 100 people dying since like 2015 to 2023. So that'd be 8 years. And then if we look at Palestine, 174, 108, 77. So 100, 300, 350, 650, 800, 850 plus another 337. That's like 1,200 plus another 200. So that's 1,400 people died in Palestine in those same 8 years. So it was about 100 people dying in Israel and 1,400 people dying in Palestine. So 14 times as much. And then Ethan's like, wow, well, if you put it in the context like that, then what's he going to say? Hamas is so much more dangerous than the ANC was. I mean, a relatively equal amount of people died because of Hamas. Like, Hamas killed a relatively equal number of people as the ANC did in the same time period. But Israel killed literally 14 times the amount of people that either of those guys did. So what is the point that we're trying to make here again? That Hamas is a uniquely horrible group, even though they killed a relatively similar amount of Israelis as the ANC did in apartheid South Africa?
Confrontations.
Yeah, I mean, that really puts it in perspective, in my opinion. Whenever people make that comparison, it's like, well...
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of saying...
Like what? Sorry, I have to run this back one more time because Ethan does not finish the fucking point that he's trying to make, so I can't respond to him. He's just saying like, oh, wow, look at the difference in numbers there. You don't know the fucking number. You don't know the numbers.
Obviously, yeah, violence is a broad term.
You said 71 people died in what time frame?
Between 76 to 84 in about 8 years of confrontations.
Yeah, I mean, that really puts it in perspective, in my opinion. Whenever people make that comparison, it's like, well...
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of saying like if we're talking about violence for the Palestinians, there'd obviously be a difference between armed militants in the West Bank destroying an outpost, right? Or even if like a settler tries to go up and set up an outpost, like the idea of like a Palestinian armed militant going up to them with a gun and saying, no, fuck off, like go back to your own country, okay? Like that's because that's the only way they can enforce that. I'm like, okay, yeah.
Wait, does he really think that individual Palestinians can tell military outposts to leave the West Bank? They can just go up. They can just go up with a gun and be like, "No, get out of here! I have a gun. You have to go. You have to follow my orders." And they wouldn't get murked on the spot. Like what he's describing is a colonial imperialist power in the Israel army, slowly expanding its borders and defending their settlers with their military. You cannot have single fucking Palestinians with like a pistol go up and be like, out, 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 go, out. That's not how it works. You need to have like a actual resistance group. You need to have the military power of a group like Hezbollah, which is the largest non-military, it's the largest like non-national military force in the world to actually effectively resist Israel. And Hamas isn't able to resist Israel. There is no Hamas in the West Bank. There's no like military group in the West Bank that can push back against Israel. So ironically, what Bad Empanada, or what's this fucking guy's name? LonerBox? What LonerBox is advocating for here is resistance groups to rise up in the West Bank. And he's like, yeah, there should be resistance groups in the West Bank that push against Israel. But yet but also according to him, when leftists support these resistance groups, then they're anti-Semitic.
Good, do it. Yeah, I'd completely support that kind of behavior, but that's not what Hamas does. Hamas went into Israel proper and killed whoever, right? So
I totally agree. On the West,
I mean, they did kill military groups too, right? So again, if you're going to say that it's valid to target military installations, then why are you condemning Hamas in general? Why aren't you only condemning the killings that Hamas did of non-army people? And we can take a look at the October 7th death toll. Let's just pull that up right now. So let's just take a look at the Wikipedia article, because you know I love Wikipedia. So let's take a look at the casualties. So the latest figure on total number killed during the attack based on Social Security data is 1,175, of whom 379 were Israeli security forces and 796 were civilians. 26.6% of those killed were female. Initially, up to 1,400 people were reported killed. On the 10th of November, it was revised down to 1,200, and since then it's been revised down to 1,175. So we can see this is gender percentage of October 7th. So what is that? 379 divided by 1,175, about like a third. Yeah, so that's 32. That's 32%. So Hamas killed 32% military targets. Why are you not criticizing those then? Like, shouldn't you be supportive of those and just criticize the 68% that Hamas killed? I mean, it's really dumb. But I mean, LonerBox doesn't really care about civilian deaths at all. He just cares about people in, he just cares about people in Gaza killing civilians, but he doesn't care if the civilians in Gaza get killed. And we saw that he'll actually run defense for Israel doing that. Oh, well, I know that some kids were sniped in the head, but did you know that kids run really fast? Maybe those IDF snipers thought that they were Hamas militants. They were counter snipers, actually, and they were about to lose their position.
Bank, like, these people are, when you talk about like colonial settlers and stuff, like that's what's actually happening in the West Bank right now. And these people are, like, I mean, more or less valid military targets, in my opinion, right? But in Israel proper, as you describe it, what would you say? Because I think a lot of these activists would say, well, actually, Israel's all stolen land. So what's the difference between the West Bank and, like, around Gaza, the kibbutzim?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Ethan has criticized Bad Empanada in the past by saying that, like, all Israeli settlers are valid military targets, and Ethan just said that exact same thing. So Ethan is now saying settlers are valid military targets. Does he realize that settlers are civilians and that they have their families with them? They have little kids. They have people that have, like, never, I mean, maybe they fired a gun because you have mandatory conscription in Israel, but a lot of people are civilians. A lot of people haven't been in the military and at least are not active military, right? So how does he square this circle
around Gaza?
For to hear Americans say that, like, okay, so you would actually be fine if a Native American decided, okay, it's time, we're taking it back. We won't actually take it back. We know we won't take it back, but what we could do is we can just kill as many Americans as possible before the army comes in. Like, okay, if you concede to that, and then it doesn't make any sense. Like, the idea of Israel being stolen, that's where you get into a bit of a difficult territory there when it comes to Israel being stolen land. That when people talk about colonialism and Zionism, and maybe like farther left people don't really see eye to eye with me on this at all, I think when people try to make these comparisons, I don't think it's very helpful to compare Israel, like Israeli colonialism, which I think is real. I don't think it's worth comparing it to something like to Algeria under France or British-run Kenya, because the difference is that a colony is like a place that is controlled by a mother state that has the colony there on its behalf with the goal of plundering the land and exploiting the locals. That's the goal, right? Jewish people, in large part, didn't go to historic Palestine because they wanted to enslave locals and plunder the land. What is there to plunder in Israel-Palestine? They went there because they felt like they had gone through 2,000 years of persecution in Europe. The Middle East was a bit better, but not great. And they decided that the only way that we can actually ensure some level of safety for the Jews is to have our own state, where we exist as a majority, where we can't be persecuted by another majority. And most Jews disagreed in Europe. They thought that if we become more integrated, if we get rid of a lot of our obvious Jewishness, we'll be a bit more safe and we'll just become like regular Germans or French people. They were wrong. The Jews in Germany who watched the Nazis come to power and had all their property taken away from them, some of them killed, some of them put into camps, they were more integrated at that point than they'd ever been. That was a very well-integrated German Jewish community, and they were murdered for it. So I think if there had been no anti-Semitism in Europe and the Middle East in the 19th century, Zionism would have been a really stupid idea. It would have been a complete, like, there'd have been no reason for it. It would have been completely unjustified. That's my opinion. But because that wasn't the case, and because you're dealing here with people who don't have anywhere else to go, who don't know anywhere else, who are not going back to Poland or Brooklyn or Iraq or Libya or Yemen, well, they're there to stay. And the way I see it now with Israel-Palestine is, although the foundation of Israel was built on, I'd say, at very least problematic terms, pretty unethical actions, sometimes downright atrocities like the 48 War, those people are not going anywhere. There are two national groups who live in that area. And we know that they don't really want to share power. They don't want to share a country. So at that point, you need to say that, well, you can't just reverse histories to some ideal point. There's to some Goldilocks zone in a particular year. You have to deal with what we're given now. And what we're given now is two national groups in this land. I think the most logical thing to go from there is to separate them. One person gets their country, the others get theirs. Maybe one day they'll decide that they want to coexist in a binational state or whatever Western leftists like to talk about when they're drinking coffee. But that's not today. Palestinians need a state now. I think that's what makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of stupid stuff there. One thing about Zionism that we should talk about is that the people that were doing Zionism and were trying to create the state of Israel, they knew that the idea of Zionism spreading would lead to friction between Jewish communities and their non-Jewish neighbors. So Bad Empanada was talking about how Jewish people wanted to assimilate into like the nations that they were living in and become citizens of Germany, become citizens of the UK, and then anti-Semitism ruined all of that, right? And that is true. Like, people that were ostensibly assimilated were still targeted by Nazi Germany because of their Jewish ancestry. And so, yes, there is very real anti-Semitism, but then there is very real anti-Semitism created from the idea of Zionism. And we can take a look at this. The 1 million plan was a strategic plan for the immigration and absorption of 1 million Jews from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa into mandatory Palestine within a time frame of 18 months in order to establish a state in that territory. So people knew that People knew that the idea of Zionism and Israel establishing a state, creating conflict with Arab countries in the area, would create conflict between Jewish people and their non-Jewish neighbors, and that would drive Jews out. So, like, literally, Zionism is creating hardship for Jewish people, not in Israel. And it's definitely creating hardship for Jewish people in Israel, because everyone surrounding Israel hates Israel because of their apartheid policies.
Yeah, part of my issue with this whole conversation is like, even saying like, oh, I'm in favor of a two-state, like I feel like to Hassan and his community is like genocidal. Like that makes you a Zionist, right? And again, not even from like a nationalistic Zionistic perspective, just from a pragmatic point of view, to look at that situation and say, I think we can like lift the blockade and let everybody in Gaza and the West Bank have free reign to go into Israel and basically just, fully integrated from one day, just lights are on, the borders are gone, full integration. Pragmatically, that seems like a total disaster. I mean, that would be like, all the governing bodies in those areas are pretty much dedicated to violence against the Israelis, and it would just, I think it'd be crazy, right? I mean, it would be fucking mad to do that.
So, like pretty rich coming from Ethan. Again, we can look at the casualty numbers in the ongoing occupation between Israel and Palestine in this 8-year period between 2016 or 2015 and the end of 2023. Israel's literally killed like a factor of 14, 15 times as many Palestinians as Palestinians have killed Israelis. And Ethan is saying that the Palestinians would be bloodthirsty when the borders get dissolved. Like, it's almost like these borders are protecting the Palestinians from Israel. But obviously that's just kind of like a sick joke. But yeah, so the reason why what Ethan's talking about is a reactionary ideology, it's an example of reactionary ideology, is because Ethan does not understand that the violence is coming out of the conditions of subjugation that Palestinians are living under. That is where this violence is coming from. And again, when you get rocket fire every day, that is because that's the only option left for Palestinians to resist against what Israel is doing. Tried diplomacy, they've tried economic pressure, tried peaceful demonstrations, and they've been met with brutal, bloodthirsty violence every time they've done that. And again, Israel would have bowed down at this point if they didn't have the backing and the shielding of the United States, which has been protecting them from enacting a two-state solution. And we can also talk about how Israel has been they've been nurturing the more radical part of Hamas, and by refusing to do deals with any other moderate group that will rise up and represent Palestinians, like Netanyahu likes his subjugated people radicalized, right? He likes them radicalized because then there's no real potential for peace forward. Because, as I said before, the radicalization that people are undergoing are that's their only option left to them. And that would work if the United States was not there, basically breaking open this closed system that Israel and Palestine exist under. The United States is putting its massive foot down on the scale and weighing it in Israel's favor. So it's a reactionary ideology because Ethan thinks that these governments would just be as bloodthirsty as they are now. And again, I don't even think that these governments are bloodthirsty right now. I think this is the violence that we're seeing that Hamas is doing and that Hezbollah is doing, that comes out of a place of desperation against Israel. I don't think it comes out of a place of anti-Semitism or bloodthirstiness. And Ethan, this is reactionary thinking because Ethan thinks that that's just innately what these governments are. And if Israel got rid of it, like if Israel stopped oppressing them, way more Israelis would die. It just doesn't make any sense. And it is a little bit racist, and it is reactionary thinking from Ethan Klein here. And then you can see that his main goal is that Israel maintains its its Jewish supermajority in terms of like its ethno-state stays the same. That's Ethan's goal, and he will do so many mental gymnastics to try to justify that goal. So what are the mental gymnastics he does? Well, the first thing he does is he overlooks the idea that the violence in Hamas is coming out of the oppression that Israel's doing. That's a pretty big one. Like, overlooking that is a bad sign. The other thing that he does is he will say that it's easier to get rid of the settlers in the West Bank than it is to stop oppressing Palestinians. Like, he'll say, I'm just trying to be pragmatic here. What is simply the easiest thing to do? And he'll say displacing hundreds of thousands of people is easier than simply stopping oppressing Palestinians. That's mental gymnastics. And then he'll justify all of that by saying that if you criticize me, you're anti-Semitic, and also I'm not saying he is saying that that's the correct position to take, but if he ever gets pushed on it, he'll say, I'm not saying that that's the best position to take. All I'm saying is that that's the position that Israeli Jews have. So why should we change what the Israeli Jews think? Let's try to work around what they're thinking. And what he doesn't seem to understand is that Israeli Jews want Palestinians to die. Like, the vast majority of them just want to get rid of all Palestinians. And that's not even an overstatement. Like, there's countless clips you can find online of Israeli Jews being like, yeah, I think we should kill all Palestinians. And the more moderate ones will say, I think we should expel them, and that's our land. But they should go, like, Europe can take them, Egypt can take them, Lebanon can take them. Just get them out of here. Those are the moderate ones. Oh my God. Why did this shut off?
Like, the way apartheid ended in South Africa was because at the end of the day, both groups were eventually persuaded into it. Obviously, the ANC, Mandela, offered that. He said that they wanted white people to have a future in South Africa. They considered race relations going ahead. Desmond Tutu, the Rainbow Nation, it was supposed to be. And the white population were eventually persuaded into it as well, which is why I think just before apartheid ended, there was a referendum. And the white people were asked, do you want to keep negotiating with the ANC or not? And they mostly voted yes. So you can't just like dissolve the border and just expect everything else, all else equal, to stay the same. Like, at that point, you're just turning a war into a civil war. So, right. And I think this bears out in the polling as well.
Wait, Bad Empanada literally just contradicted himself. He said you can't just dissolve the border and expect everything to stay the same. Yeah, people wouldn't expect it to stay the same. You would see less violence, like quite obviously less violence. And then he said you'd just be turning a war into a civil war. So you're saying that things would stay the same, even though you just said that you can't expect them to stay the same. So, again, I think he's just talking out of his ass here. He's literally contradicting himself in the exact same sentence. Like, the beginning of the sentence contradicts the end of the sentence.
It's like, there was a poll very recently that asked Israelis and Palestinians the question, do you think the other side wants to get rid of you, either to kill you or kick you out of the land? And I think 90% of both groups said yes. I think it was like slightly more Israelis than Palestinians, but it was about 90% each. Yeah, there's a lot of distrust between these two groups. So the idea that, and I think even if you look at polling on the one state for two people versus two states, or there was one poll that actually also inserted a third option, which was one state, but an unequal state without equal rights. And the order of preference for both groups was two states first, then one state that's unequal and undemocratic. And then the last option was one state for two people. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I find that's the ironic part, is like all these people who are talking about one state's the only solution. It's funny because the people who live there, none of them want one state. None of them. The Palestinians and the Israelis, nobody there wants one state. It's like because they understand that it's not a viable option. It's like a non-starter of a conversation. It just seems like.
Yeah, I mean, how come the How come the North in the American Civil War didn't ask the plantation owners what they wanted to have happen with their slaves that they owned? Like, what the fuck are we talking about here? Why do we need to take into account the oppressor's opinion on what they want? Again, like apartheid in South Africa ended because of, in large part, due to international pressures on the national apartheid party, and that caused them to bend to that. So if America pressured Israel, then Israel would bend to it. And you want to know a great way to get people to stop hating each other? Make them interact with each other. Have you ever been in a road rage moment? There's a reason why road rage is so common. It's because you are in isolated little boxes, and you do not have that level of human interaction, which makes them more understandable to you and makes you more empathetic to them. And so like little interactions that you see on the road turn into like these big deals because you do not have that level of connection with the person. It's the exact same thing when you are like in a separate but equal system, which is what Ethan Klein is advocating for. Like, is Ethan Klein really going to, like, Ethan Klein would basically be the type of person that would support segregation in the Jim Crow South. Well, if you look at surveys, white people don't want to be assimilated with black people, and black people don't want to be assimilated with white people. So why are we trying to say that this system needs to end? Aren't you being a little bigoted by not asking the opinions of people that are living under segregation? Why aren't you taking their opinions into account? Again, extremely reactionary thinking from Ethan, and a lack of understanding of the systems that create conflict, essentially.
Magical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it necessarily has to be that way forever. But again, Palestinians they need a state now. They don't need to wait 20 years before people start to absorb the same like multicultural opinions that we have in the West, right?
So how do you make a Palestinian state with like the way that the government is now, how they're like constantly absorbing land from the West Bank and kind of just looking the other way, or in some cases just greenlighting settlers to steal what is essentially Palestinian land?
That's a pretty big question. I think the international community and the
it's like because they understand that
yeah.
it's not a viable option. It's like a non-starter of a conversation. It just seems like magical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it necessarily has to be that way forever. But again, Palestinians they need a state now. They don't need to wait 20 years before people start to absorb the same like multicultural opinions that we have in the West, right?
So how do you make a Palestinian state with like the way that the government is now, how they're like constantly absorbing land from the West Bank and kind of just looking the other way, or in some cases just greenlighting settlers to steal what is essentially Palestinian land?
That's a pretty big question. I think the international community and the support for Palestinians should be pointed a lot more in that direction. I think there were efforts not even that long ago that involved like boycotting of products that came from the settlements. I think it was like it eventually, not too long ago, led to European companies just refusing to stock any produce that came from settlements. And it resulted in expansion at least slowing down in some areas. And people said that, yeah, this is actually hurting our enterprise. So obviously, more of that is a good thing. I think governments, I think it was a really good thing that Biden started putting sanctions on settlers, and particular, I think even maybe one or two settlements themselves, like the outposts. I think that kind of pressure is a really good thing, and I think I really wish that a lot of the activism was maybe pointed more in that direction, because to me, it's a much more black and white thing. I don't think anyone can defend settlers. I went to Israel and Palestine in the summer and interviewed people from both groups. The most frustrating conversations I ever had there was not with Palestinians who sympathized with resistance or anything like that. Like the frustrating conversations came from settlers, because on the one hand, they would do this thing where they would say, yeah, we're here because Israel's a small country and we need to expand our frontiers so it's harder for people to attack us, right? Like if we weren't here, the terrorists would be closer to Tel Aviv, right? It's a small country and all that kind of thing. But they'd also talk about how this is historic Jewish land. This is Joseph's tomb and Rachel's and the tomb of the patriarchs. And I would try to ask this question where I'd say like, okay, if the security issue was not a problem, would you give up this land for peace? And they wouldn't answer, like, they would kind of skirt around the question. And I felt like such an idiot. I tried like 3 times to rephrase this question because I thought they just weren't understanding what I was trying to say. And they just still wouldn't answer. And I said, yeah, because those people they're expansionists. They just want territory. They don't care about the security. It's just something that is easier to sell to the rest of the world. So I think there's a lot that needs to change with regards to policy from Israel's allies. And I think settlements is a really big thing. I don't think it's the end of the world in terms of two states. I don't think land swapping was really the big issue in the peace process. I think the issues were more fundamental than that. But there are still, people, Israeli leftists who don't have any support behind the scenes talking about ways that you can fix the maps up to make this work. And I just think there needs to be a lot more pressure in that direction. And I think same with Palestinian leadership as well. I think if Palestinian resistance was about frustrating the settler enterprise compared to what Hamas is doing, then that would be a much more amazing thing.
That's a good point.
It's not a good point. I mean, Hamas is trying to frustrate the settler enterprise. And then when LonerBox is talking about how we need more pressure against the settlements, yes, we do. But guess what? The entire world is against the settlements. You know who's not against the settlements? Joe fucking Biden. Like, he's letting Israel do whatever he wants. And guess what? Also, Donald Trump is going to let Israel annex the West Bank. So when we're talking about more pressure against settlements, we should boycott settlement-produced goods and services. That's irrelevant. That's fucking irrelevant. You know what we need to do is change the public opinion in the United States about this shit. So I just want to read this too because I'm a little bit interested. So what does this say? The Gaza Strip has been under military occupation by Israel since June 6, 1967, when Israeli forces captured the territory. In 2005, the UN, international human rights organizations, and several legal scholars regard the Gaza Strip to still be under military occupation by Israel, as Israel still maintains direct control over Gaza's air and maritime space, 6 of Gaza's 7 land crossings, a no-go buffer zone within the territory, and the Palestinian population registry. Wow, great. Palestine is so separate. I mean, one good thing about this conversation is that neither Ethan nor LonerBox is trying to pretend like Palestine is a free state right now. Like, they're admitting that Palestine is not a state. I want to see the disengagement. So what made them disengage from Gaza? While the disengagement of Israel from Gaza was first proposed in 2003 by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and adopted by the government and Knesset in 2004 and 5, the actual unilateral dismantlement of settlements occurred in 2005. The decision to disengage from Gaza was not met with support from the Israeli public, with a May 2004 referendum showing 65% of voters were against the disengagement plan. Well, why did they disengage then? By 2005, there were 9,000 Israeli settlers spread across 21 Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, while around 1.3 million Palestinians lived there. The first settlement was built in 1970, soon after Israel occupied the Gaza Strip following the Six-Day War. Each Israeli settler disposed of 400 times the land available to the Palestinian refugees, and 20 times the volume of water allowed to the peasant farmers of the Strip. Following disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005, all Israeli settlers were evacuated and all settlements were dismantled. In late January 2024, it was reported by an unnamed Israeli military officer that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and others in the government had requested the military members begin to establish permanent bases in the Gaza Strip. So yeah, they're just invading that right now. Disengagement of Gaza Strip. Let's look at Britannica. So what's the background? So the cost of occupying the Gaza Strip weighed heavily on the Israeli public, especially amid rising casualties among soldiers who were deployed to defend the settlements. In 2002, the idea of evacuating the settlements before negotiations recommenced was floated by the leader of the Israeli Labor Party, then the largest party on the Israeli left. In 2003, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon embraced the idea, despite strong opposition within his own Likud party. That December, Sharon unveiled a plan for the complete removal of Israeli settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip. At the insistence of the United States, the plan later included the evacuation of 4 small settlements in the West Bank. So, what are we seeing here? Well, the people in Gaza had violent resistance against the settlers, which Ethan supports, and also the United States was putting pressure on Israel to pull their settlements out of Gaza. And guess what? That pressure from both the Palestinians and the Americans caused Israel to actually stop being a little bit genocidal and colonial, and they did pull out of Gaza. So there was pressure on Israel in terms of the military and the expense of maintaining those settlements, and they were forced to pull out. So again, it's an example of terrorism actually working. And this is violence that LonerBox and Ethan Klein would actually support.
Well, are they doing anything to the settlers? Is that even like a focal point for like Hamas?
Sometimes, so yeah, there are lots of confrontations. The problem is that they tend to go for settlers, and at least in part.
So when was Hamas created? Let's just pull up the Hamas Wikipedia. When was this charter made? Were they elected in like 2004? So it's governed the Israeli occupied strip since 2007. So the Islamic Military Resistance Movement, abbreviated as Hamas. So I guess they emerged. Okay, what is this? The Hamas movement was founded by Palestinian Islamic scholar Ahmed Yassin in 1987. It emerged from his 1973. So in 2006 Palestinian legislative election, Hamas secured a majority. In the Battle of Gaza, they liberate Palestine from Israeli occupation. Egypt began its blockade of Gaza in 2007. This was followed by multiple wars with Israel, which began with the 7th. Okay, so anyway, like Hamas has existed since 1987. So yeah, I'm sure they had a part in fighting against settlers to get rid of the occupation that was happening in Gaza.
Because they can't get to Israel. I think in, was it August? I think it was August this year, the end of the month, there was an IDF raid into Jenin, like a big Hamas stronghold in the West Bank. And it's so stupid how these narratives get kind of like spun in the West. But I think the IDF went in there and they crossed quite a few lines. They bulldozed the roads and they caused quite a bit of destruction. But I don't think anyone, I watched a bunch of left-wing channels talking about this, and Al Jazeera and the rest of it. I don't think a single one of them mentioned that. I think 11 people died in the first day of those raids. But I don't think a single outlet mentioned that every single one of those people who died was claimed by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, like fighters, every single one of them, on their own websites. And they even said that what they were doing was they were building explosives to use either on settler communities or on Israelis, because it happened just like a week after or 2 weeks after a botched suiciding attempt by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They tried one in Tel Aviv and it failed. So, yeah, again, that's always been an issue, I think, is like, I don't really know if there's ever been like an armed resistance sort of agreement on the Palestinian side to kind of like focus on particular targets rather than others. It seems to be like they'll go for Israelis in Israel proper. They'll go for settlements that are right on the border that are probably never going to go back, or they'll go for outposters, which I think are a lot more justified. But yeah, I don't think there's ever been like a really focused
so if you're
attack
living
on one group. Yeah,
I'm kind of curious what your opinion is. If you're living in Gaza and you were born there, and obviously we all know that.
Okay, so what is this? Soldier killed in fierce clashes in Jenin as IDF presses major West Bank operation. Locals say they do not have access to water and electricity. Israel says at least 26 gunmen killed during operation. Palestinian terror groups have claimed 13 as their own. So 13 of the men that were dead were Palestinian terror groups. Is this going to be a little bit more specific than Palestinian terror groups? So the slain soldier was named as Staff Sergeant Elkanah. So what was this? What was the operation that they were doing? So it says an Israeli soldier was killed and 3 others were wounded during fierce clashes with Hamas gunmen in the West Bank city of Jenin on Saturday morning. The IDF has been carrying out a major raid in the northern West Bank since early Wednesday. The action was now largely focusing on the Jenin area after raids in the Tulkarm and the Farah camp near Tubas concluded. According to initial IDF probe, troops carrying out a raid in Jenin encountered 2 gunmen considered to be prominent members of the Hamas terror group. The soldiers exchanged fire with the 2 terror operatives from close range, killing both of them. 4 soldiers were hit by the gunmen, including Nevan, who later died. One of the wounded troops, an officer, was listed in serious condition. They neutralized dozens of explosive devices that were planted along the roads. We are dismantling the terrorism that comes from the refugee camps in Judea and Samaria, Halevi was quoted by the IDF as saying. We are cut off from the world, Tahir al-Sadi, a Jenin resident, told AFP. The water is cut off, the electricity is cut off, the sewage system is no longer working, all the infrastructure is destroyed, we no longer have any services that work. The bakeries are at a standstill, we can't find milk for the children. I think it's the worst day since the start of the raid. Wissam Bakr, director of the Jenin Government Hospital, told AFP of the IDF's operations on Saturday. We hear from time to time clashes and sometimes there's big bombings. It's very hard for the children and for everyone. We are afraid. We are terrified. Look at all the damage. Jenin resident Faiza Abu Jafar told AFP as she stood amid piles of rubble. We are living in dark days. Okay, so this is like an article kind of ripping into the IDF. The Israelis are besieging the hospitals and cutting off the city from the refugee camp. So what? Okay, here we go. So far, amid the operation launched earlier this week, the IDF says troops have killed at least 26 gunmen. So this is not on a single day, but I guess a single operation, and detained another 30 wanted Palestinians. The terror group Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have claimed 13 of those killed as their members, according to AFP. The situation in the West Bank was further escalated late Friday night when 2 car bombs exploded in the Gush Etzion area south of Jerusalem. 3 Israelis were hurt. Bro, cry me a fucking river when you're talking about 2 car bombs that hurt 3 Israelis, and yet there's like major bombings going on all the time in both the West Bank and in Gaza from fucking airplanes dropping like massive bombs on buildings, and you're going to be writing that 3 Israelis were hurt, and that's an escalation of the situation. Okay, so anyway, like I don't really understand the point of this. It's basically saying that Hamas is in the West Bank, like pushing back against Israeli occupation. Like, that's what? Wait, what was he trying to say there? Like,
Jenin, like a big Hamas stronghold in the West Bank, and policy from Israel's allies. And I think settlements is a really big thing. I don't think it's the end of the world in terms of 2 states. I don't think land swapping was really the big issue in the peace process. I think the issues were more fundamental than that. But there are still, people, Israeli leftists who don't have any support behind the scenes talking about ways that you can fix the maps up to make this work. And yeah, I just think there needs to be a lot more pressure in that direction. And I think same with Palestinian leadership as well. I think if Palestinian resistance was about frustrating the settler enterprise compared to what Hamas is doing, then that would be a much more amazing thing.
That's a good point. Well, are they doing anything to the settlers? Is that even like a focal point for like Hamas?
Sometimes, so yeah, there are lots of confrontations. The problem is that they tend to go for settlers, and at least in part because they can't get to Israel. I think in was it August? I think it was August this year. The end of the month, there was an IDF raid into Jenin, like a big Hamas stronghold in the West Bank.
Okay, so just one thing. This is by the Times of Israel. LonerBox calls this a big Hamas stronghold. What is the quote? We're dismantling the terrorism that comes from the refugee camps in Judea and Samaria. During the raid on the Jenin refugee camp on Saturday, the IDF said troops neutralized dozens of explosive devices that were planted along the roads. So, no, this isn't a Hamas stronghold. This is a refugee camp. I mean, insane amount of disinformation coming from this guy.
And it's so stupid how these narratives get kind of like spun in the West. But I think the IDF went in there and they crossed quite a few lines. They bulldozed the roads, and they caused quite a bit of destruction. But I don't think anyone, I watched a bunch of left-wing channels talking about this, and Al Jazeera and the rest of it. I don't think a single one of them mentioned that I think 11 people died in the first day of those raids. But I don't think a single outlet mentioned that every single one of those people who died was claimed by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, like fighters, every single one of them, on their own websites. And they even said that what they were doing was they were building explosives to use either on settler communities or on Israelis, because it happened just like a week after or 2 weeks after a botched suiciding attempt by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They tried one in Tel Aviv and it failed. So, yeah, again, that's always been an issue, I think, is like, I don't really know if there's ever been like an armed resistance sort of agreement on the Palestinian side to kind of like focus on particular targets rather than others. It seems to be like they'll go for Israelis in Israel proper. They'll go for settlements that are right on the border that are probably never going to go back, or they'll go for outposters, which I think are a lot more justified. But yeah, I don't think there's ever been like a really focused
so if you're
attack
living
on one group. Yeah.
So his criticism is that Hamas is firing rockets into Israel, or that they haven't had like a single target that they're only targeting. This is so dumb. Like, why are you criticizing someone? Why are you criticizing Hamas? Let's just stick to Hamas. Why are you criticizing Hamas for having a diverse array of targets? Like, this is the same kind of person that would criticize Ukraine for, oh, well, you shot a missile base that's inside of Russia. And I know that the missile launching pad would shoot missiles at you back, but that's too far. Like, you should stick to just targeting Russian soldiers that are inside of Ukraine. You shouldn't blow up any bridges. You shouldn't target any military installations that are inside of Russia, because that's a war crime, right? So dumb. I mean, Ethan has even said that settlers are a valid military target. Like, he literally said that in this conversation with LonerBox. And then just one last thing. I mean, LonerBox said 11 people died, but no one talked about how they're all Hamas fighters or all resistance fighters. Well, that's not what this article says. This article says that so far amid the major operation launch earlier this week, the IDF says troops have killed at least 26 gunmen and detained another 30 wanted Palestinians. The terror groups Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have claimed 13 of those killed as their members. So that means 13 that were killed were not claimed by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Maybe there were just random Palestinians in the West Bank trying to resist a violent occupying force. And again, this fucking guy, LonerBox, said that was justified. He said it was justified if someone walked up with a gun to settlers and was like, get out of my land, I have a gun, go, go, go. And so, it looks like 13 people did try that and they got killed. And he's like, no one talks about how all of these people that died were Hamas members. Well, isn't that a good thing? Because the Hamas members were pushing back against settlers. Like, these guys do not have any kind of solid position on any of these things. But anyway, we're halfway through this conversation between Ethan Klein and LonerBox. I am going to end it for today, and we're going to pick up on the other half of this conversation tomorrow. This is a slog. I hope you guys can appreciate that I'm really going through this in detail and trying to fact check as much as possible. These two morons, they are spreading a lot of disinformation. So I appreciate you watching, because I'm trying to correct the record on a lot of what they're saying. And yeah, I hope that you like the format of this video that I'm going through. Like, there's no one really going through every single minute of this content, and that's why I started this channel, so that I can comb through this in painstaking detail. But let me know what you thought I did well. Let me know if you missed anything. Let me know what you think I can do differently for part 2. So stay tuned for part 2 tomorrow. We're going to cover this Ethan Klein versus LonerBox conversation, part 2, tomorrow. See you then. Wait a second. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving.